Welcome to London's New York. This is a show about New York City, and it's built around conversations between me and a friend of mine, Dan London. He's a historian, a grad student in the history department at NYU, and also a philosopher, a socialist agitator, a part-time tour guide, and one of the smartest and most interesting people I know. He loves New York more than anyone I've ever met, and in this series I'm letting him take me and you on a tour of his New York. Places that are off to the side of the usual tourist trail, each revealing something interesting and maybe surprising about the history and spirit of this amazing city. And we're going to start this show somewhere you might not expect for a series about what is almost certainly the most capitalist and secular city in the country, if not the world. We're starting in a church. Specifically, the massive Cathedral of St. John the Divine on Amsterdam Avenue between 110th and 113th Streets in Manhattan. It's a crazy mishmash of Gothic and Romanesque architecture, and its main space is one of the biggest open rooms I've ever been in. Certainly one of the most imposing.
The scale is really incredible, and it's amazing how when you walk in here, you're forced to whisper, like there's nothing telling you to, but...
No, I mean, there's this... Right now we're standing in the apse of the cathedral, and there's this great profusion of pillars that are about, I would say, 6-7 stories above us, and immediately the sense of scale. I mean, in the sidewalk there are street lamps, there are signs, there are decorations that are close to your eyes, but here people are just dwarfed, and it's not the dwarfing that you see in a Rockefeller Center or next to a skyscraper. It's you are enveloped, and sometimes skyscraper lobbies try to create this sense of you are beholden to the architect, but here there's this it's on an entirely different level of the heavenly city.
You know, I have to say, standing here, it's not entirely a pleasant sensation to be enveloped in this space. There's something kind of... It forces you to feel small in a way that I find kind of disconcerting.
It takes, in some ways, an even more sinister appearance as we go further into the church. I mean, you compare this church to St. Patrick's, and St. Patrick's is entirely lit up. It's beautiful, it's pristine, there's all sorts of nice frills and ornamentations, but, I mean, where we're standing now, it's almost terrifying. I mean, this is the part I remember seeing as a boy, and it still almost frightens me. You're looking up at the ceiling, and it's pitch black. And you're looking ahead, and out of this blackness is emerging this apse. And it's in fearful symmetries, as William Blake would say, the symmetries of this rising altar, and behind it this blazing Christ figure with the light coming in, and then above it this window that's clearly beautifully ornamented, but the light is just barely peeking through. And it's all these different shades of what faith can be, this shining thing and this dark thing, and all in the context of this great black void. I mean, this is a necessary building, and this is why I think this is the most important building in New York in some ways, where New Yorkers have to come face to face with the existential fears. It's one of my most amazing experiences I've had in New York, actually, was here, where there was a performance of Debussy's La Mer, this late 19th century symphonic piece, and this whole space, this gigantic apse, were just crowded with people, not just standing up, but people having to go up on these pillars a little bit, to have to stand sort of inhabit every nook and corner of this building. And I got there a little bit late, so I was just going through this crowded city almost, this enchanted world with this music going through, and everyone just rapt, staring and listening. And it was as if all of New York or all of civilization was here in one place and together, letting this sort of eerie rumbling wave of beauty suffuse them. And I got a sense of, I mean, it was similar to the definition of sublime, which is just beautiful and terrible at the same time. It was as if it was sort of the end of the world, where people were forced to gather in this cathedral and just all together praying as if for some kind of salvation that was coming to them in the form of this music. And the people in their desperation climbing beyond their prescribed places on the floor, but having to climb up the sides of the cathedral. It was as if it was a civilization about to be ruined. I mean, this is a place of seriousness. It's a place where you have to dwell to a certain extent on the scale of things. And it's not nice to be reminded of where you are in the scale of things in some ways. And it's not accurate to think that this is the only scale of things, that we're only minute compared to the great things. But, I mean, in every church is a place where people are married, people are born or baptized, and people are buried. And all of the circles of life that aren't in our house happen there, and it forces you to dwell. And I think that being in this cathedral, the scale of it is doing something similar, being confronted with the questions of what is this thing, this man.
So, but why a church? Why is a cathedral the most important building in New York? Why that cathedral?
In some ways, this church seems to set itself apart, quite literally, from the dominating logics of kind of corporate capitalism and the sort of infrastructure that supports it in the lower parts of the city. I mean, you have these banks that look like temples. It's as if Jesus threw the moneylenders out of the temple, and the moneylenders like, oh, sure, we'll just build our own temple, right? So all of these things around capitalism, it's their own form of faith. There's all sorts of assumptions around human nature and human worth and what the ends of life are for that are built into those things. So if you are seeing New York through a certain lens, it's full of religion, but it's just an incredibly vapid kind of religion of dog eat dog, And on the converse, in terms of the faith, a kind of leftist or liberal faith in the need for social justice, that there's a possibility that we could improve things on earth, which is in some ways one of the core tenets of Judaism as it's come to evolve, I think, then there's a tradition in New York's political history that is suffused with a kind of religious yearning for communion and peace between people. There's any number of counter spaces in New York. You could look at Union Halls, you could look at Washington Square Park, you could look at the East Village, and those all represent a kind of grassroots opposition to the dominating forces in the city and in America. But the church represents something a little different, I think. It's romantic maybe, but it's representing a continuity to a much older set of priorities.
It's a kind of building that you don't really, it's kind of architecture you don't immediately associate with New York City. It's this massive kind of medieval sense of what a building should be. What do you think it's like to have that kind of incongruous thing in the middle of a city?
I mean, the irony is, in a sense, Gothic architecture have always been very incongruous within cities, because when they first started going up in the Middle Ages, cities were not Gothic. There was no Gothic city. There was a Gothic church surrounded by vernacular huts and small buildings and whatnot. But the church always stood apart from its surroundings. It was always looked a little different. And it's ironic because the whole community often would revolve around the church. The church was this great temporal power, but it did not look like it belonged in many respects. It was almost like it didn't exist anywhere. It didn't belong anywhere. It's this strange, fearful kind of architecture. And so churches always seem a little out of place in cities. They've never given themselves over to a whole form of urbanism. The closest we get to that are college campuses, ironically. In the early 20th century, a lot of colleges like Princeton and Yale tried to create mini cities based on Gothic architecture because they were trying to imitate Oxford and whatnot. But, it's always fun to see them try to adapt Gothic to an auditorium or a lunch hall or a dorm or something. It's always a little weird, And of course, it's especially weird in America because we borrowed all this architecture from Europe. We brought it over wholesale. But even in Europe, it's never as fitting to its community as maybe some Americans think that it is.
So it really is an architecture of sort of awe and fear and
of
separateness.
Of separateness, I think. I mean, there's any number of maybe churches that could be a little more humane, but I think St. John gets, in a way that not too many other American spiritual buildings do, much less just churches or cathedrals, the sense of awe and sort of terror that could accompany a lot of religious or spiritual feeling.
We'll be right back after these brief messages. Racecar Radio is proud to support the work of Aya Worldwide, a tenacious and dedicated organization working to address the root causes of poverty in West Africa. Because they believe that who a person is and where they come from should not solely determine what they are able to achieve. To learn about their work and how you can support it, please visit ayaworldwide.org. If you're enjoying this show, you might also like some of the other podcasts on Racecar Radio. For instance, try Composition Notebook. Two musicians, close friends who grew up in the same city but leading very different lives, coming together to share their music and help each other figure out art, parenthood, livelihood, and the 1,000 things that challenge us all as human beings every day. Composition Notebook. 2 songwriters, 1 conversation, endless possibilities. Listen and subscribe now at racecarradio.com. And now back to London's New York. Let's talk about Judaism for a minute, because you are a Jew.
I'm the tribe, yeah.
Not to out you.
I'm not a Jew. I'm just Jewish,
Yeah, I can relate to that. But what does it feel like being a non-Christian, being in your case, a Jewish person, to be in a monumental space that is overtly Christian?
The values of Christianity, or the sort of meta-narratives of Christianity, which is about sacrifice and redemption for the sake of for entering a whole other world, whether it's heaven, or for bringing redemption collectively to humankind through the actions of gods or angels. That is so different from the messages in many aspects of Reform Judaism. For so much of Judaism, it's about doing good in the world here, which is an enormous thing. It's what brings spiritual energy and the energy of tradition to so many of Jewish activists today. They can say, our tradition is that you help the people on earth now while you're alive. But what that does is it gives humans a great degree of power. It really is saying humans can control things.
I also grew up in Reform Judaism, and I don't know, the mythology of Christianity is so powerful, and it's so different. I mean, Christianity is sort of aggressively spiritual in a way that a lot of Judaism isn't, which is much more sort of practical.
Growing up, I didn't really have any special association. The synagogue architecture never really did it for me, because the synagogue architecture, what distinguishes a synagogue architecture from a Christian church? I mean, you're seeing a Torah, you're seeing a bima.
That's like a podium for you goys out there.
Yeah, but there was nothing, but in a sense, it was commiserate with the message of a lot of these Reform sermons, which was this very sort of vague, do good for other people, be nice, sort of these Enlightenment era things, which are important, but it was not the same as going to a church where there are these stories and myths, these acts of violence and sacrifice on every wall, and where, this ornamentation and design is running this gamut from the great domes of St. Paul's to this intense, fearful symmetries and fearful darkness that you find in the Munster cathedrals or in St. John's. When you go to a Catholic service and they're stressing, the sinfulness of man, the powerlessness of man, you don't have to go all the way with that, but there is a truth there. And how do you translate that into architecture? And for me, St. John and some of this Gothic architecture actually does that. Just fundamentally, the kinds of values and stories there are hitting these notes that I just don't get in many other circumstances. It has to do with the kind of narratives that the architecture is expressing, which is not about be nice to other people. It's about, you are this little worm, and what are you going to do about your fallen state?
I mean, New Yorkers are not notorious for being humble.
Right.
Let's say. I mean, this is a city where people overtly come to become a master of the universe in Tom Wolfe's.
Yeah.
And so what do you think the function of a city like New York that's so ambitious and aggressive and, is of a giant, awesome, quiet space
how
like
can
that?
you, how can you be humble in New York? It's a very good question. I could read a quote from what's his name, the guy who did Great Gatsby, F. Scott Fitzgerald, that relates to this. I could pull it up quick.
Sure, yeah, go for it.
From the ruins, lonely and inexplicable as the Sphinx, rose the Empire State Building, and just as it had been a tradition of mine to climb to the plaza roof to take leave of the beautiful city, extending as far as the eye could reach, so now I went to the roof of the last and most magnificent of towers. Then I understood. Everything was explained. I had discovered the crowning error of the city, its Pandora's box. Full of vaunting pride, the New Yorker had climbed here and seen with dismay what he had never suspected, that the city was not the endless succession of canyons that he had supposed, but that it had limits. From the tallest structure, he saw for the first time that it faded out into the country on all sides, into an expanse of green and blue that alone was limitless. And with the awful realization that New York was a city after all, and not a universe, the whole shining edifice that he had reared in his imagination came crashing to the ground. So this, it's an anecdote, but it's again this notion of, what can bring humility to a New Yorker. And when you're surrounded by nothing but concrete, you can lack that. So the only way of getting that is through parks or by being on such a tall building that you are managing to peek over the parapet and seeing a little bit of the limitless. But, between nowadays, you could look on top of the empire and you could see suburbs going still pretty far. So what we're left with are, we have buildings, we have people we're looking at, and through the internet, of course, we're endlessly going to be clicking on our own, promoting our own knowledge, our own intelligence. So, it's a tough place to be humble. That's for sure.
Why is that important? Obviously it's a space, profoundly a space, back to St. John's, that's designed to create this feeling of humility and this feeling of of awe before, you know, the massive power of God or whatever. Why is that an important thing? Why is that good for us?
Well, I mean, the traditional folly of, let's say, urban planners, they see the city from the sky. They look down, they imagine they can move people at whim, they can move buildings at whim, and they are, not aware of how their plans could affect people, but also they're not aware of, you know, building in one place could have these repercussions that they would have no idea, you know, could happen based on the actual behavior of humans in them. The 20th century is the century of overweening ambition, of ideologies that have no bearing or no connection to how humans understand and live their lives. And so being humble about your theories and your hopes is very important if you're not going to cause untold destruction and suffering among people. There's so much of a movement now, I think, in spiritual communities around mindfulness. The emphasis is on recognizing that your thoughts are not you, that you are something apart from your immediate needs and wishes, that your thoughts are often confused and wrong, and you somehow need to get perspective on those things. So the way we're getting perspective is often through mindfulness, meditating in your room or whatnot. But there's a history of New Yorkers trying to stress this kind of humility, this kind of detachment from the self. And it's been through parks, but it's also through some religious edifices like St. John's. And too many churches in some ways don't give you that kind of detachment because they're bringing you into them as this conscious appreciator of ornamentation, of light, of sermons, of texts. But St. John, if you're in the right mindset, it gives you a sense of, it envelops you with this sense of a very fruitful insignificance, surrounded by the darkness, by monuments to the suffering of others, by people who are built by people who are dead, who are different than you. It gets you out of yourself. You know, when you're up on top of a bridge and you're looking at the whole city, all the people, you realize, you know, that compared to them, you're just one person, you're insignificant. But at the same time, there's something very mighty and ennobling about that realization that you are part of this collective enterprise, right? So that's what going to some of these churches can do. And I wouldn't be mentioning it if there were lots of places like this. But there aren't really in New York. You know, ironically, the people who actually run the church are these liberals whose message is very similar to Reform Judaism in that let's change the world, let's make the world a better place. It's very pro-human. But they're doing so in the context of a structure that's saying all is lost, repent. You can't do anything. It's such a funny juxtaposition. I think that's the tension that we always have to live with, you know, how much we can do, how little we can do, that we're better than we think we are, and we're far worse than we think we are as well.
My name is David Hoffman. With me, as always, is Daniel London. London's New York is a production of Racecar Radio, www.racecarradio.com.